Hello, greetings, good people. I hope that you are well. My name is Colin Ehara, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Paper Plane podcast. I'm very, very excited. I also am resisting the urge to fall into perfectionism. And so just want to say, as I jump into this first ever episode, am I ever doing hosting a podcast the perfectionism is something that I've inherited from many generations, um, and I'm a recovering perfectionist, so I'm working at being okay with things not going exactly as planned, and so I'm here to do my best as I jump into this very new kind of creative expression in my life, but I'm also incredibly excited to kind of share this and also be in community with you in this way. And also, to be in dialogue with so many people that I love and respect moving forward. And I'm very, very excited about it all. But with that said, going to jump into things. I will also do my perfect best to, while I am recording this as a video, to do my best to do it as if it's only via audio, so that for those tuning in just listening, that I'm ensuring that I'm explaining in the best ways possible what is going on. But with that said, again, welcome to the Paper Plane podcast. My name is Colin Ehara, and for our agenda today, so I'm going to be introducing myself as the host. I will go into kind of an introduction with regards to the podcast, some of its aims and intentions, and then I'm going to talk about the paper planes with regards to the different books that have had, enormous impacts on me, the ways that I see the world, the ways that I try to reflect and take action in the world. The first kind of plane of existence being what I call Let's Get Free, a nod to Dead Prez's 2000 or 2001 hip hop album. And this one is going to specifically focus on some of the books that have impacted my political education, first and foremost. The second plane, I will be looking at is literacy for freedom, and that's specifically kind of thinking about critical pedagogy, critical literacy. The third, I'm calling masculinity, with MASK being the first part of that masculinity phrase, really looking at cis heteropatriarchy, and three, different books and authors that have had major impacts on me, and also that have, numerous controversies surrounding them. And then from there, fourth out of five, the fourth plane, I'm calling disoriented, a nod to fiction and fictive fragments, but kind of incredible storytelling via fiction literature that has deeply impacted me. And then last but never least, a nod to the notorious B.I.G.'s song. I have named this one I Got a Story to Tell, and this is on memoir. That has impacted me greatly. And so before I jump into all of those things, I would love to take a nod to one of my literary heroes, social justice ancestors, James Arthur Baldwin, who once said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive or who had ever been alive." Huge shout out to James Arthur Baldwin, one of, if not my favorite writers in the English language. And so I want to begin by talking about what the scholar Alan Peshkin called searching for subjectivity. All right. And so a lot of times in academia, or like people having arguments about sports teams, and everything in between, we, consciously, unconsciously do our best to try to be objective in how we kind of present things. And in his work, Alan Peshkin really talks about the importance, of us as researchers and academics being fallible, imperfect human beings, and how incredibly important it is for us to interrogate what our frame of references are and what potential, kind of conscious and unconscious biases we hold. Right. And so I want to name some of at least the conscious biases that I hold and some of the lens that I hold, knowing that, none of these things are necessarily inherently negative, right? But I think that it's important that I'm naming them because this is the perspective from which I am communicating through the lens through which I view the world, at least in this moment in time. And so I identify as a multiracial and mixed heritage, pigmentally challenged, very, very light skinned, East Asian, white, Indigenous American, and person of color. I am Nikkei, which means fourth generation Japanese diaspora. I am Scottish Celtic. I am Palatine German, and I'm Haudenosaunee Mohawk. I am neurotypical, able-bodied, and I have an asterisk by that one because when I was 4 years old, I had what was called a mastoidectomy procedure, which removed most of my inner ear and part of my eardrum. So I'm partially deaf in one of my ears. And I'm also, but it is also a disability that I'm able to hide. I am heterosexual and married. I am a cis man, male-bodied person. I'm a U.S. citizen. I was raised working class with ascension into the middle class. I got an asterisk by that one, only because I have a mountain of student loan debt sitting atop me, like many of those who are millennials or Gen Z. I'm an educator. I'm a researcher, an organizer, a writer. I'm a perpetual student. I love learning. I love teaching. I am a product of Richmond, West Contra Costa Unified School District. I am a father. I'm a partner, husband, son, brother, uncle, friend, comrade, colleague, mentor, mentee, cousin, community member, former athlete, trying to hang on doing my boxing class and hit class thing, a former artist. I will talk about that in a little bit, but this is an attempt at jumping back into some creative expression right here. I'm a former dean of students and an English teacher, and currently I am a community college professor of ethnic studies. I'm also, I forgot to mention, I am in my early 40s, so I'm middle-aged, which is another piece around the different intersections of my identity that's very important to acknowledge. And so I want to begin with talking about two major kind of cultural expressions that have impacted my life in very, very powerful ways. And the first is talking story. And so talking story is an indigenous Hawaiian theory and practice that stresses the dire importance of knowing, honoring, and being able to speak extemporaneously to your family and ancestors' lineages. And it's important to note that countless indigenous, African, Asian, Pacific Islander, Arab, Latinx, etc. cultures, BIPOC cultures honor oral history in the same or similar ways. I want to shout out my homie Tadashi Nakamura, incredible filmmaker, but one like really, really beautiful example of this is to check out his film Mele Murals, M-E-L-E Murals, M-U-R-A-L-S, about an indigenous Hawaiian school where essentially two really powerful graffiti artists who are both Native Hawaiian, Estria and Prime, come to this school to essentially help help the young people to express their meles, their songs of their ancestors via graffiti. A dope marriage of kind of indigenous ways of being and seeing hybridized with hip hop. And so if you know me well, those kinds of things mean the absolute world to me. And in kind of saying some of this too, like especially with hip hop being a huge aspect of my life for as long as I can remember, just wanted to honor as much as I possibly can the spoken word, because something that happens in Tima Okun talks about white supremacy culture and just like a hierarchy that can exist where the written word is held above all, and so in saying that, so much of like what I'm going to be talking about on this podcast is my love for books and reading the written word, but as I say that, I also want to make sure that I'm acknowledge the importance of the spoken word, oral history, passing down tradition, culture, via talking story. And the second piece around cultural expression that I want to, kind of highlight, that's meant so much to me is what is called kintsukuroi. And kintsukuroi also can be referred to as kintsugi, but kintsukuroi means, in Japanese, means to repair with gold. And it's a Japanese form of pottery, the art of repairing pottery that has been broken or shattered or ruptured, repairing it with gold or silver lacquer and understanding the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. So once it's put back together, right, you can see the places where it's been broken, but it's been, repurposed, it's been put back together with precious material, right? And so this is something that in my research in the master's in teaching urban education social justice program that I was in over a decade now ago at the University of San Francisco, I entitled my research Kintsukuroi, and what I was doing as somebody who was about to become an English teacher for the next decade, was identifying, deconstructing, and ultimately resisting quote unquote formal standard academic English supremacy in US schools, and the ways that legacies of colonialism, white supremacy have held up this particular kind of language dialect that exists within the English language as being consciously and unconsciously falsely tied to being of higher levels of intelligence and higher levels of morals and ethics. And essentially what I do through my research, and I'm building upon the research, I'm standing on the shoulders of incredible ancestors and scholars and mentors as I did so. But problematizing this idea that if you speak formal standard academic English, that it makes you more intelligent and or more morally or ethically solid than those who do not speak formal standard academic English or English at all, right? So these are things like highlighting all the various incredible strengths in things like African American vernacular English and hybridized forms of English like Taglish, Chinglish, Spanglish, and mixtures of all of it, right? And I say that particularly as somebody who grew up in Richmond, California, and predominantly raised working class BIPOC public schools, and how important it is to identify and disrupt dehumanization, whether it's affixing false halos or horns to different ways of being and seeing and or to human beings. And so in the vein of both talking story and kintsukuroi, I wanted to briefly kind of talk about and share a piece introducing myself, where I will be talking story. And the name of this song that I'm going to jump into, and actually before I do that, I'm going to play a very short clip of, just kind of going back a little bit, probably over 10 years ago at this point, to my performing with my homies, the Tenderloins, in San Francisco, and just the huge role that hip hop, in this case specifically MCing, has played in my having love for language, my being able to teach in front of many multiple classes of 30 or more students and not have stage fright, and a lot of it comes from all the things that I owe and am indebted to hip hop culture, which must never ever be forgotten, is Black cultural expression, and rooted in like a phoenix rising from the ashes, surviving, being targeted for domination and or destruction by white supremacist colonial heteropatriarchal capitalism in the Bronx in the 70s. And with that said, I'm going to play that brief clip for us. Yeah.
on an MP3. Damn, the bass on the thing where we say, what is it? At it again, my friend. You should pay us a visit. Tell her from the bay by the way that I move. Smooth and I grew up on that rhythm and blues. I stay hardcore. From my ass to my shoes. Lace up in life's game, cash me on the view. You can tell her from the bay by the way that I move. Smooth and I grew up on that rhythm and blues. I stay hardcore. From my ass to my shoes. Lace up.
Shout out to my folks at Tenderloins. One of the first books I'm going to talk about is what he called a fictional autobiography by the professor of art and Asian American studies, Kip Fulbeck. And the name of this book was Paper Bullets. And while I didn't necessarily identify with like every single aspect of the protagonist in this book, when a friend gave it to me years and years and years ago, it was the first time in my entire life that I'd ever read a book where the protagonist was a multiracial Asian American man. And I remember just being incredibly, magnetically pulled into the story. And for the first time kind of wondering like, could I potentially write a book someday, from my own lens. The author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, in her probably my favorite TED Talk, one of, if not my favorite TED Talks, The Danger of a Single Story, talks about how, when she was growing up, because pretty much every, book that she had come across was coming from this European or quote unquote Western lens that, she thought that all the characters that she would have to write about would be, from places where it was cold and they would eat apples and couldn't necessarily situate herself telling a story where, the main characters looked like her. And so I think this broke the door open for me in so many different ways, just as far as in the same way that ethnic studies did. And just, it being made real in my mind that my story could matter. And so could, that of folks like me or of, other Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And so, this is a way that I've introduced myself to, I've lost track, but, countless classes each time that I've had a new class for, at this point, the last decade, if not more than that. And the name of this piece is Paper Bullets. And essentially what you'll kind of hear me do, one of my mentors from San Francisco State University, Dr. Weming Dariotis, kind of talked about how in this song that I've written, I think in 2006 maybe, I'm essentially taking these three aspects of the kind of legacies from which I emerge and unbraiding them, because myself, all of these things exist within me. And it's important to understand too, as a mixed heritage, multiracial person, that I have never had the monoracial experience of any one of these things. All right. So in this, you'll hear me kind of talk about my Japanese heritage, my Scottish Celtic heritage, and then also my indigenous Haudenosaunee Mohawk heritage. And, with the knowledge that I've never, singularly saw through the lens of any one of these, but it's been, a simultaneous multiple identity through which I view the world. But that said, this is Paper Bullets. Hajimemashite, it's nice to meet you. O genki desu ka? I'm greeting you in Japanese because I am the Nihonjin blood inside Masashi. The Yonsei hombre kamikaze, little boy whose crippled joy you burned to death in Nagasaki. Stole my wealth when Roosevelt uprooted me. I told myself, just go with your community. A wounded crane whose bruised brain was locked up in a furnace. Man, a troop train and troopers came and dropped me in internment. The no boy sergeant in the 442nd, the poster boy for dirty Jap up in the war, you remember. The kid you thought was good at math, he learned to drive in cooking class, and nerdy herb with crooked glasses inside the looking glass. I'm taking all your jobs, and while there's immigration laws, I serve your stars and sushi bars and build your cars for your applause. Uncle Sam, you can rock my war song, cause Japanese Americans are oxymoron. I hate it when they say I shouldn't. Spray the world with paper bullets, cause paper cuts for hatred couldn't make up for this racial bullshit. Hey, how's it going? This is all my Scottish blood, erasing labeled white with hatred, fighting lack of love. I never wanted privilege if him in my skin would have the pleasure to be set up as an infant, to become a damned oppressor. When guilt consumes me, at times I look away from the horror of filthy movie rated XXX, I paid for and ordered. I don't want to be a cop, a judge, or a politician, but I benefit when any of them send a black man to prison. Listen, I'm beginning to understand. I'm giving the upper hand and privilege from Uncle Sam. It cripples me inside the ways I've lost my culture, so I nip at ethnic pride like a demonic vulture. I better remember the ones who got it better than ever made this hate to chase that blame away just like 11 September. If only for a day I'll know that I'm Scottish and chop a lion tyrant's head like William Wallace. I promise. I hate it when they say I shouldn't. Spray the world with paper bullets, cause paper cuts for you couldn't make up for this racial bull. I know it's hard to see me, but I'm still alive and kicking, surviving sickness and all the genocides afflicted. I'm Colin's native blood, thin and hanging on for life. My skin's been light and cries been silent, sick and strangling all my life. Preparing you, I'm choosing to come clean because America diluted my bloodstream. And it's embarrassing because Lucifer's one thing, but American hysteria is abusive and unclean. Shooting me for loot to seize my emeralds. Yeah, scrutiny for wounded knee and General Custer. My spirit's flow is limitless. No part retreating back. Haudenosaunee Turtle Clan, Mohawk to be exact. Smallpox of firewater living in hell. Here, locked in reservation like Leonard Peltier. Colin has to represent me through ridiculous rhymes, because if he don't, one more indigenous dies. I hate it when they say I shouldn't. Spray the world with paper bullets, because paper cuts for hatred couldn't make up for this racial bullshit. The last samurai, the last king of Scotland, the last of the Mohicans, rolled into one. Man, my raps have to die like saplings in autumn, because everything's impermanent. It's over, I'm done. One. Thank you for listening again. Welcome to the Paper Plane Podcast. I am Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara. And The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself, where I will interview folks that I am blessed and honored to share community with, and I will ask them about a book or books that have had a transformational impact on their lives. In a society where literacy rates are steadily declining, and a growing number of podcasts hosted by cis men consciously and unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, and LGBTQIA Two-Spirit Plus, especially BIPOC folks, this space aims to operate as a counter-narrative. These are the aims and imperfect intentions, at least. The Paper Plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, of community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, and freedom for literacy and literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as metaphor for the quote-unquote flights that we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers, and how these journeys shape us as human beings. And so when I start here with the first plane that has impacted me, I have entitled it Let's Get Free. And this is really about political education. And this is actually going to be the most books that I'm going to be talking about within one plane, and touching and going a little less deeply on each of them. But I just couldn't not include each of these. And it was killing me to even leave out a few other ones. But I got to start with James Arthur Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, which is how I first came into contact with James Baldwin. If you are familiar, it opens with an essay entitled A Letter to My Nephew, also entitled My Dungeon Shook. This is an essay that I have taught for years and years and years to students, and essentially being kind of one of the ways that I get to know them as well. Because, in this essay, he writes to his very young nephew, essentially trying to provide him with, wisdom, advice, kind of guidance around what he'll need to be looking out for as a Black boy who will grow into becoming a Black man in the United States of America. And so, kind of across the board, every single year, students have, really resonated with it, loved it, talked about the different ways that, that, unfortunately they see it being incredibly relevant to today. And then from there, I've turned that into, after we analyze and kind of dialogue about the essay, I've turned that into what, I call the prophetic letter assignment for students. And so in that assignment, they will write a letter either to their younger self, to somebody that is a younger person in their own lives currently, a younger sibling, for example, a younger cousin that they care about, giving advice, sharing wisdom. So whether that's to the younger self or to a younger person in their life. And then their third option is to write to an unborn child, right? So if they have want or wishes around potentially, having a child someday, writing a letter to that child, and what are the hopes and wishes and potential aspirations that they might want to have for them. And it's given me these really, really profound insights just into who my students are, especially if it's the first time I'm ever working with them. But I think that this particular essay, this particular book, right, has inspired so many incredible writers. Ta-Nehisi Coates comes to mind immediately for me, with his Between the World and Me, which was a letter to his son, his latest The Message, which is a letter to his students, Kiese Layman's Heavy, which is essentially a letter to his mother, and has inspired me, right, to write letters to people in my life, and kind of that as a platform, as a genre of writing within literature. But yeah, James Baldwin, openly queer, brilliant black man raised poor in Harlem, New York. And we light a candle for you, Sensei. Thank you so much. Secondly, I jumped to Frantz Fanon, and where I meet Frantz Fanon is his book, The Wretched of the Earth. Frantz Fanon, a clinical social psychologist from Martinique of African heritage, who was educated in Paris, France, and essentially writes about the relationship between the colonial forces and the colonized, and the impacts of colonialism on the colonized psyche. Intensely powerful, for lack of better terminology. Really don't actually have words to kind of describe how impactful this book has been on me and the ways that I view the world. And I think I particularly want to highlight chapter 1 on violence, because of the ways that it has upset my preconceived notions of like what violence is or was in my mind. And particularly thinking about, in what ways are we ensuring that we are not becoming historical suffering, falling victim to historical amnesia around, legacies of colonialism, the violence that's been inflicted, continues to be inflicted on historically dispossessed communities, specifically those that, Fanon called the wretched of the earth, those who are melanated, folks of color, the global South, in quote unquote third world countries, right? What Walter Rodney would call underdeveloped nations, who have been stolen from and colonized and plundered. But can't recommend, this book more in thinking about, particularly if you haven't thought much about violence, or have a very, very kind of specific, explicit, rigid definition, whether you're aware of that or not. I would highly recommend checking it out. I then go to Paulo Freire, and Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Interestingly enough, in my teaching program, I remember coming across a white professor who, when he was talking about kind of different books that have, been held, at least in the kind of modern era around teaching, that have, been impactful. I remember he held up all these different ones, and he held that one up and he said, what I need everybody in here to understand is that some people treat this like the Bible. And it didn't hit me until like shortly after I'd kind of had a few classes with him, that he was saying in a very like kind of negative way, that he was framing pedagogy of the press as kind of like people who really were into it, like myself, as these kind of fanatical or, kind of dogmatic or, uncritical, um, rigid folks, which is so funny and ironic to me because, my and so many of the people that I love and in solidarity with have a completely different understanding of pedagogy of the oppressed, as it being the polar opposite of that. It being about being critically conscious, about questioning, about perpetual reflection, and then being able to change our actions as we change our mind. Being in perpetual reflection about liberation from oppression, as opposed to wanting to become more rigid or dogmatic, being less so, and about ultimately, centering the oppressed, but ultimately, like the aim of ending oppression also being the liberation of, all those who occupy oppressor roles as well. And so this is something that I haven't continued to go back to, that hasn't continues to mean so much to me, particularly as it pertains to teaching and pedagogy, the science of teaching and learning within education. I then jumped to Eduardo Galeano. Eduardo Galeano, I met through his book Upside Down, A Primer for the Looking Glass World. He is probably best known for The Open Veins of Latin America, which is, an incredible kind of historical account of, the colonization of what we today call Latin America. But highly recommend all his work. But this one specifically was gifted to me by the person who was the executive director at the nonprofit organization that I first came into straight out of undergrad. And shout out to Leticia Hernandez, who is now a professor at San Francisco State teaching literature. But I remember she gave this to me as Secret Santa, and then I found out it was her. But just like fell in love with Galeano instantly, because one of the ways that he writes, at least a lot of his books, is he writes these shorter kind of vignettes. And one of my mentors says brevity is brilliance, and so I think the ability to pack a ton of information beautifully into a tight space is just like something that I aspire towards, and I'm not very good at, as you can tell with me kind of going through all of these things. But essentially thinking about like Alice in Wonderland, going through the looking glass, and his kind of arguing that we are actually, through the looking glass, that we are existing in a society and a world where everything is backwards, right? Where greed is rewarded, where being kind and compassionate will get you taken advantage of. But just so many profound insights, just laden with beautiful language. Also, rooted in his being a historian and a journalist at the same time. But Eduardo Galeano, rest in peace, rise in power. To one of our literary ancestors. I then go to bell hooks. Can't say enough about just the impact of bell hooks on education, on just our abilities to love ourselves and each other. All About Love, being one of her more famous ones. But where I first meet bell hooks is her book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. And it's very much being, building upon the work of a pedagogy of the oppressed and Paulo Freire. There are also some amazing, kind of discussions, dialogues, debates that the two of them have that you can kind of look to. Where they're pushing each other, and I think bell hooks, particularly coming from the lens as a Black queer woman, just highlights so many different arenas that Freire has gaps in knowledge around, and while also her highlighting his brilliance and her gratitude for the work that he had done. But teaching to transgress, I think what it really did is just gave me tons and tons of language that helped me be able to articulate, what I felt in my heart, in my spirit, in my soul, in my mind, when at my best, around how deeply relationships matter as it pertains to teaching and learning, especially if you are the teacher learner as opposed to the learner teacher. And so for those of us, who are in teaching positions, just how vastly important it is to vehemently never be okay with the degradation of any human being, um, or to celebrate, one person's, real or perceived success at the expense of other people, and just how incredibly important, building relationships is. Not just within teaching, but as it pertains to change work in general, or just trying, our imperfect best to leave, this world a better place, when we pass on, than it was when we were born into it. And so, to another ancestor, thank you so much, with love and respect, for eternity, to bell hooks. I then go to Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I came across this text. A friend actually gifted it to me right before I was about to board a plane, where I flew to West Africa, Ghana, specifically the University of Ghana, Legon, where I studied abroad for close to 6 months, studying post-colonialism. And it radically shifted my lens in the ways that I thought about, not just Africa, but underdeveloped, nations, the global South, countries, continents around the world, in the ways that I've, thought about settler colonialism and its impacts in the present day. What I think is really, really important to, at least communicate about how important this book is that if you are unfamiliar with Walter Rodney and or his text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is that shortly after he publishes this book, that he is assassinated with a car bomb. He, is from Guyana. He is, Black, of African ancestry. But is assassinated shortly after this comes out. And also, this book goes out of print for decades, right? And so it wasn't until very recently that it came back into circulation again, right? So if, the powers that be not only see fit that it's really important to them that he is silenced by, by murder, and then that, his spirit and his work, is cut off by, them, stopping publishing it. What questions should that bring about for us, right? For anybody who is, critically minded, particularly as it pertains to being wary, if not outright, combative towards authority. What should that suggest to us, that those two things are reality? And so when I first read it, I actually had a used, first edition copy that was, really, really hard to find back then. And as I continue and I'm almost done rounding out this particular plane of Let's Get Free in my political education, I go to, who is probably tied with James Baldwin as my favorite writer in the English language, the Indian writer, journalist, philosopher, organizer, Arundhati Roy. And, most famous for, her award-winning book, a novel, The God of Small Things. But what I highlight here actually is one of my favorites, called Walking with the Comrades, where she essentially, kind of joins this indigenous community in India, where in rural India, and where this indigenous, historically dispossessed indigenous community, has adopted this Maoist, communist framework, and has essentially armed themselves to defend their community, because their indigenous land sits atop all these different kind of natural resources that the state wants to extract and essentially wants to eliminate, this community or these communities so that it can extract these resources from the earth, render them moonscape so that nothing will grow there ever again, and while also displacing, or performing ethnic cleansing of this indigenous community. And so, just like the ways that she paints the pictures of of, the humanity, the struggles, the strengths of this community, while also highlighting, problematizing, historically, specifically being an Indian writer, her problematizing, the ways that Gandhi gets held up as being this kind of pinnacle of human achievement because he used nonviolent resistance, and how problematic that is if and when a community is being targeted for literal destruction and erasure, right? For genocide, for ethnic cleansing, because what she says is that nonviolent resistance is a form of political theater, and that if you don't have an audience that cares, right, or to quote Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture, if your audience lacks a moral conscience, then nonviolence doesn't make sense, essentially. And you actually you have no choice but to, pursue other options. And so, what Arundhati Roy says essentially is that human beings have the right to resist their annihilation. And, I think this, along with, in conversation with The Wretched of the Earth, with How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, maybe specifically played a huge role in, my, again, questioning what people call violence, and, what I would argue, Frantz Fanon would call, the comrades displaying forms of revolutionary violence against the vertical violence of the state. I end with the Palestinian American scholar Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism. And Orientalism, if you are, unfamiliar, essentially captures brilliantly, beautifully, the ways historically and in the present that the quote unquote West, Europe, and European, historical European settler colonial nations have viewed the quote unquote East, which includes Asia, Africa, the quote unquote Middle East, and and essentially as exotic, as subhuman, as perpetually foreign, strange, and thus being these kind of ways of being and seeing of Orientalism being utilized to justify perpetual theft, war, colonialism in these parts of the world, while the West benefits from these things with regards to material resources. And I think this has played such a huge role in my development because it added different layers to how I understand white supremacy and racism, specifically from the lens of an Asian heritage person whose grandparents were forced into incarceration centers in the United States during World War II. But I close this particular plane just by, with open heart, open mind, and all the gratitude I can muster, thanking, these sensei, these mentors, these elders, these ancestors, as I move to the next plane. And the next plane is literacy. I call it literacy for freedom. And, in thinking about critical pedagogy, critical consciousness, critical reading, critical literacy. And so I start with Zora Neale Hurston, one of the, kind of titans of the Harlem Renaissance. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a novel, that's meant so much to me that I've taught for years and years and years. That the writer Alice Walker, just holds up as one of the most important novels that, she has ever read in her life. And if you are unfamiliar, Zora Neale Hurston in this book specifically is just absolutely, delivering a masterclass as it pertains to, what we call code switching, quote unquote, right? So using all this kind of flowery, formal standard academic English prose as the narrator of the story, and then, with the from the perspectives of the different characters, having this early 1900s Southern African American Floridian vernacular English, that looks similar and also wildly kind of different depending on which character she's embodying. But the audiobook is read by Ruby Ruby Dee, and just absolutely gorgeous. And often what I would do, particularly when I was teaching English in high school, it was I would have, chapters where we would listen to Ruby Dee, and read along, just so we could kind of get, an aspect of kind of like what, this might sound like. And so I would, if you haven't read it, highly recommend reading it. And if like a special treat, listening to Ruby Dee, rest in peace, reading it to you is an absolute treat. Um, and also how so much of that worked into my research around problematizing formal standard academic English supremacy in U.S. schooling. I then go to Malcolm X, El Hajmalek El Shabazz, in the autobiography of Malcolm X, is told to Alex Haley. Just a phenomenal work, transformed into a biopic directed by Spike Lee. But I specifically think about this because I regularly would teach the chapter around his, being incarcerated, and the ways that he, in his own language, talked about finding spiritual freedom even while being incarcerated and behind bars, and because of being able to read and all the different, kind of stories that he would connect to via reading, via the paper planes, right, that he boarded, and the journeys that he took, but also the profound growth, just spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, that he gained from his being a voracious reader. I mean, an autodidact, right, and so like a self-taught, self-educated person who didn't necessarily go through, these institutions in ways that I did, for example. But a huge, deep bow to Malcolm X and to Alex Haley. I then go to, goodness gracious, one of the greatest sensei in my entire life, Octavia Butler, and her novel Kindred, which I also taught for many, many years, right? And so one way that I kind of, one of the core philosophies at my former school was the West African Adinkra symbol of Sankofa, which was depicted as a bird that was kind of advancing forward, but it was looking back, and inside its beak or was holding an egg, in this particular symbol of the Akan speaking people. And essentially Sankofa symbolizes moving forward into the future while ensuring you don't forget what has happened in the past, and making sure that also the egg signifying the future, and taking care of the future by knowing where you've come from. And so I and literally translated Sankofa, meaning it is not taboo to go back and fetch what is in danger of being forgotten. And I would argue that that is a central theme in Kindred, because in this brilliant towering science fiction writers, Black feminist science fiction writers story, Dana in the present day 1970s gets sucked back in time to the antebellum South during the times of slavery, or at least institutional legalized slavery. I could go on a whole other tangent there with regards to the new Jim Crow and the prison industrial complex, but for now I will stick with Kindred. And she gets sucked back into the antebellum South around the time that Frederick Douglass, is working as an abolitionist. But she essentially, is surprised to find that, she is there to be in connection with some of her ancestors. And I will not spoil, kind of what those connections look like with her ancestors, but, her going back and forth from her present to the antebellum South in the 1800s, just so many profound kind of pieces around why it's direly important, specifically if you are a U.S. citizen, if you consider yourself an American, to not fall victim to what Henry Giroux calls the violence of organized forgetting, particularly as it pertains to the dehumanization of Black people, and what the activist and educator Scott Nakagawa calls the fulcrum of white supremacy as anti-blackness and anti-black racism, and its intersections with cisgender heteropatriarchy and violence against women. But incredible novel. I can't recommend it more. And I close this one out, Literacy Freedom for Freedom, with a journalist who was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, one of my intellectual mentors, heroes, Chris Hedges. This was put on my radar years ago, but this particular book, I believe, comes out in 2000 and I want to say 7 or 8. I apologize for not knowing the exact year, but the entire title is Empire of Illusion: The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. And essentially, I would say that Chris Hedges is incredibly prophetic in all the different essays in this. But the first being it's entitled The Illusion of Literacy, and he essentially talks about the ways that things like social media, reality TV, all these different things that kind of suck away our attention, but also at the same time, halt or grind down our ability to pay attention for extended periods of time. Historically, when these things have happened, when we become more of an image-based society than a literate society, right? We also have tons and tons of attacks on public education that limit people's ability to be able to be functionally literate or to be, highly literate, and therefore highly critically, conscious, and critical thinking is really harder and harder to come by. Because of all these different, kind of ways that these things are tied together. But that, essentially what he documents is that anytime this has happened in any complex society throughout history, that, that society becomes more and more fascist, that large swaths of populations, lose their human and civil rights when these things happen. And so, this direct correlation of societies being highly literate with being, highly democratic, and societies being, they lower our literacy rates, that the lower, kind of access to the democratic society that we actually have, pretty much ringing, true in ways that, I won't necessarily go down that rabbit hole at the moment, but I will say that if you've never come across this particular text, I highly recommend it, as I do every single thing in the plane of literacy for freedom. And where we come next is to what I call masculinity, again, MASK-ULINITY, masculinity, and thinking about the different ways that boys, cis boys and cis men, I would argue, get set up to sever our minds from our hearts in so many different ways, and how, unhealthy, kind of ways of being and seeing as it pertains to manhood and masculinity produce violence against women, and also, violence against men from other men. And so I highlight, 3 different books, 3 different authors. The first being, Junot Diaz, in his winner of the Pulitzer Prize, New York Times bestseller, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, a novel I taught for many years, a novel that, has been one of my favorite books, quite honestly, for many years, because of the different ways it talks about intergenerational trauma. It talks about anti-Blackness. It talks about anti-indigeneity. It talks about colorism. It talks about violence against women, and immigration, and the different pieces of kind of violence that exists around borders and crossing borders, be they global, regional, socio-political, and or in our identities and our minds. But learning while I was teaching this book, and I'm in the middle of this book, learning, the allegations around, his, verbally, like a pattern of verbally like assaulting women, or potentially, advancing on them in ways that, were unwanted, unwarranted. I had to do some real deep soul searching during that time, I ended up, giving students essentially the option of like whether they would, finish it. And also we examined a number of the essays specifically by um, uh, BIPOC, women of color, Afro-Latinx authors, kind of responding to some of these different allegations and all of the things that they were kind of bringing up. But this is a book that has meant so much to me, and also, unconsciously, unintentionally, sent me on, numerous journeys around reevaluating, um, the times when I have consciously or unconsciously affixed horns and or halos to different authors or just folks that I hold up in high regard. And so, I do very much believe in the vein of the writer, I would say philosopher, Adrienne Marie Brown, that we will not cancel this, and how important it is to be able to humanize folks, to be able to, hold folks accountable, and also, to not treat folks as being disposable, and also perpetually wrestling with where that line is for me, with wanting to know where that line is for other folks, and more specifically, where that line is for other folks, who are, who have identities that are oppressed in ways that I do not. I then moved to Flight by the native writer Sherman Alexie. I have to say that of all the books that I've taught, this might have had the most engagement of any book that I've ever taught. This is a young adult novel, and the protagonist is a multiracial white and native kid from the Pacific Northwest, who essentially is a foster youth, and is similar to Dana from Kindred, gets kind of teleported back and forth, into the past and into the present, but specifically into kind of seeing these different legacies of attempted genocide of indigenous peoples, and this character, not only being kind of put back into the bodies of different indigenous people, but also different white folks who are on the oppressor side of things. And kind of getting a greater understanding of kind of who he is as a multiracial white and native person, not unlike myself, who is also East Asian on top of those things. But this is something that is very near and dear to my heart, just because of how many incredible conversations, dialogues that I got to have, specifically with eighth graders and ninth graders. And if you have ever known an eighth grader or ninth grader, and especially if you have taught an eighth grader or a ninth grader, you know that engagement takes a lot of energy, time, planning, structure, and this book being very much a gift that helped to just hyper engage students in really, really fascinating community-driven dialogue around so many different aspects of identity, and development and growth, while also, acknowledging, right, that, different allegations brought against Alexie about his, having unwanted advances towards, towards women in his life, his, the allegations around being unfaithful to his partner, things like that, and my sitting with wrestling with all of it, and the different ways that even Juno Diaz said this in an interview that I listened to long ago, where he talked about internalized patriarchy in men, being this thing where we will often compartmentalize, right, and like we can, like, in this space, we can be this really good person, but then in this other space, be completely different and not be able to like integrate, kind of our shadow sides and be able to even recognize that they are there. And then I end with a novel that, it was deeply impactful to me, called What We Are. And this was by the writer Peter Nathaniel Millay, who is Samoan, American, and white, multiracial. And even on the cover of this book, there is a quote from Sherman Alexie that says that this novel is a roller coaster ride inside the haunted house of American multicultural sin and shame, the violent and smart and funny. I am excited by this new writer. And so, specifically the protagonist in this book is from San Jose. California. And so, I think to have this multiracial, protagonist that also is from the Bay Area, that also is like, into hip hop and like had ties to like working class identity, was super, super impactful for me. And while, similar to Paper Bullets, I couldn't, fully identify with everything that kind of like the protagonist was going through or experiencing, or like how they saw the world. But the mere existence of this character, again, like helped to fortify just this belief as a human being that maybe my story mattered even a little bit. And so I'm grateful for that, and also acknowledge, right, that there are allegations around physical violence towards his partner, that I don't know a ton about, and also want to make sure, that I am explicitly, critical of, and acknowledging, as I wrestle with all the different ways, that internalized oppressive patterns of behavior, specifically, for those of us who are men, and are men who are targeted to different degrees by white supremacy, and how we, kind of internalize legacies of colonialism that devalue women, femmes, queer folks, in general, and what a perpetual journey it is, to that we heal from these legacies, and that I don't have the answers, but that I'm certain that it is of dire importance that we are always forever searching and doing our best, and never stopping in those endeavors. And I come to the fifth out of 6 planes with disoriented, and I call it disoriented because these are 3 fictive fragments. These are 3 works of fiction from Asian heritage writers that have just meant the world to me. The first I start with is Min-Jin Lee's Pachinko, New York Times bestseller, been turned to an Apple TV series that takes it in a very different direction. Book is, far superior per usual, but just absolutely brilliant, intergenerational story of one family over 4 generations, a Korean family, that ultimately, legacies of Japanese imperialism push and pull them to Japan. There are, different ways that, this family has to, sell lies and, and internalize, fiction as reality, in order to survive, and then, keep, certain truths from their children. And, there's, any family that's experienced any form of generational trauma, I think, can identify with, um, speaking silence, and families like not being able or willing to acknowledge things that have happened, for fear of, of the truth being more difficult, to reckon with than just pretending that things never happened. But ultimately that these ruptures are just, um, you know, deeply, deeply impactful, whether we can acknowledge them or not. But ultimately, just on like a historical level, via this like kind of micro story of this family, really, really played a profound role in my, just like personal education around, I think specifically, the treatment of Korean heritage people in Japan, and how in so many ways, right, it mirrors the treatment of people of color in the United States. But just something that I, on both the level as far as like the quality of the kind of like the content, but also just like how beautiful the prose is. Yeah, I can't recommend Pachinko more. I then go to Mohsin Hamid's novel Exit West. This was recommended. Shout out to my homegirl, my sibling Liza Gasudin, incredible educator, organizer, mama, community member. and she recommended it to me, and just what a gorgeous, gorgeous novel. Maybe one of my favorite novels of all time, to be honest. And I probably said that about like every single book that I've named so far. But Exit West essentially tells the story of Nadia and Saeed living in a country that never gets named, but you can kind of deduce that it is a majority Muslim nation, likely, if you had to guess, in the quote unquote Middle East. But essentially, there's some wonderful, powerful, magical realism as, it's like this love story that, it does this powerful kind of rendition around just like talking about how, um, you know, uh, individuals change, relationships change over time, but also, this magical realism of people being transported through, teleported through different doors to different parts of the world, and essentially like a refugee story as well that also talks about, fleeing political persecution and war. But just, I think, there's moments where, and I've read it twice, but there's moments where I just go back to certain paragraphs and reread them over and over and over, and like take pictures of them and send them to friends. But Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, just a gorgeous book. My God. Last but never least, within Disoriented and these fictive fragments, I bring to light the famed Japanese writer Haruki Murakami, and where I first meet Haruki Murakami is south of the border, west of the sun. And he has a lot of novels, tons of novels, many much more famous than this one. But this is where I met Haruki Murakami for the first time, and just a gorgeous, gorgeous, kind of I would say love story, but the detail with which he'll describe a someone putting so much love and care into making a craft cocktail, to how gorgeous like a vinyl record of like a Miles Davis record can sound, and just like what the combination of a beautifully crafted cocktail and like while listening to a jazz record, just like uh um and and I don't know if this is the Japanese person in me, but just like his, the way that he talks about longing and melancholy, just like hit home in so many ways. But South of the Border, West of the Sun, Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Kafka on the Shore, Norwegian Wood. Right now I'm reading his new um, The City in Its Uncertain Walls, but Haruki Murakami, if you're unfamiliar, absolutely get with the program. Can't recommend them enough. Last but never least, thank you for hanging with me on this episode 1 of the Paper Plane Podcast. Is I got a story to tell, a nod to Christopher Wallace, aka the Notorious B.I.G., and memoir. I start with actually, these are 3 of my favorite books that I read in the last 3 years, I would say. But the first is Kiese Layman's Heavy, an American memoir. Kiese Layman from Jackson, Mississippi, and who teaches at Rice University in Houston, Texas now. But just an absolutely gorgeous memoir written in the form of a letter to his mother. Whenever I can find any cis man that can tap into deep, deep sensitivity, vulnerability, who can openly and courageously express grief and fear and insecurity, I try to hang on to those brothers for dear life, whether I know them in person, or I know them through the written word or the spoken word. But Kiese Layman is an absolute master teacher, I would say, when it comes to all of those things that I just named. And Roxane Gay, the author of Hunger, says, "Oh my God, Heavy is astonishing, difficult, intense, layered, wow, just wow." But huge, huge shout out to Kiese Layman, who I've never met before, but once liked my post on Instagram, and it made my day. There is a powerful on YouTube conversation between Kiese Layman and this next author who I'm going to talk about, and that is the Korean American poet Kathy Park Hong, who wrote the memoir Minor Feelings, which is, in the form of a book of essays, but Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning. But this was a gift to me from my homegirl Jai. Thank you so much, Jai Jai. But just absolutely devastatingly good. Kind of particularly um, post-Trump, talking about what it means to be Asian heritage or racialized Asian in the United States, particularly at the height of violence against Asian heritage people, and specifically those who are most vulnerable in our community, women, the elderly, and everything from her highlighting kind of the brilliant lessons that she has ascertained from her appreciation for comedy and specifically Richard Pryor, to her reckoning with her friendships with other Korean heritage, Asian heritage women, and some of those friendships, and maybe one in particular that she talks about falling apart, and her in hindsight kind of figuring out what happened and what was the rupture caused by, and in what ways did internalized racism and sexism kind of play a role in those ruptures. But just each essay just is like a warm hug and a punch in the gut at the same time, in that yin yang style of the life force that that we all experience, whether we can articulate it or not. And then I end with another one of my favorite writers, all these folks, right? But the great Ta-Nehisi Coates, the author of Between the World and Me, his first memoir, which I also love, The Beautiful Struggle. But I highlight this one, The Message, where he writes to his students, essentially the first piece being about his going to Senegal and to Africa for the first time, and his all of the different things that he experiences as an African American, making his kind of pilgrimage for the first time to the continent of Africa, specifically Senegal, and in way less kind of beautiful verbiage, him identifying, wrestling with the different ways that he had unconsciously internalized this idea that African heritage people were ugly and not beautiful, and his just being stunned with how beautiful the folks are in Senegal, and his kind of reckonings, reflections around all of that, and so much more than that. The second piece being about his being contacted by a teacher in South Carolina, where certain community members are trying to ban his book Between the World and Me, because they say it makes white children feel uncomfortable, and his going down there, and then also kind of reflecting on the different ways that there are folks who are in the South, and in these quote unquote red states, that are really trying to limit young people having access to one-way interfaces where adults can't control how they process, what they process, things as far as the human experience, but also that there are tons of folks in these places championing the ability to do so. And then finally, the piece that is most kind of well known about this particular book is his trip to the West Bank in Israel, Palestine, and his essentially being able to liken, as a child, he calls himself a child of Jim Crow, the ways that the Israeli government is essentially enacting legalized apartheid, and what I and many much smarter than me would argue is an attempted genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And so I say that as I am rocking my keffiyeh. If you are I say that if you are listening and not watching, free Palestine, free Haiti, free Congo, free Sudan, free Hawaii, land back. And I thank you all so much for joining this first episode of the Paper Plane podcast. I am Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara, and this will be the only time it'll be just me on here. I am so looking forward to the next episode and the following episodes where I will be in dialogue with beloved community members, friends, family, blood and chosen. But I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day. Take care. Peace. Thank you so much for tuning in.